Hello, this is Elaine with the BERYL Consulting Group. Today we're here joined by Dr. Richard Evans, a leading expert in intellectual property strategy at the intersection of life sciences, technology, and innovation. With extensive experience advising companies, investors, and founders, he is currently co-chair of the patent prosecution and counseling practice at Date Pitney. Known for combining deep scientific expertise with practical, business-oriented IP strategy, he helps clients protect and scale innovation across highly competitive and rapidly evolving industries. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Elaine. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So, one thing that often comes up in discussion around biotechnology is that promising science alone isn't always enough. There are many other elements that determine whether something can actually move forward. So, from your perspective, what role does intellectual property play in helping scientific innovation move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one that often gets overlooked. I think IP, intellectual property, trademarks, etc., play a really important role in helping innovation because what the intellectual property system does is it creates an incentive to disclose an invention or an innovation. So the patent system at its heart is fundamentally a bargain. You, as the inventor, get to tell the world exactly how your invention works. And in return, you get a limited, approximately 20-year period of exclusivity in which to commercialize that invention. So the initial disclosure really allows the community to build on the scientific literature. It allows other researchers to see your patent, understand your approach and your technology, and either design around it or build on it when your exclusivity period expires. So what this effectively does in the community is it creates a real knowledge diffusion so that everybody can see what's going on and basically improve and further develop that particular technological area. The alternative, I think, would be really problematic, and that's a situation where all innovators decide to keep their inventions secret, as a trade secret. And this would, I think, actually have the effect of chilling innovation in the community and would actually slow technological advance down. I think IP, if it's well done, has the ability to accelerate development throughout the entire community.
Great. And building onto that, while IP plays such an important role, there are definitely also many challenges in practice, right? So, what are some common weaknesses that you see in early stage biotech companies from a legal or IP perspective?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about here, but let's hit sort of the top three.
Okay.
I think one of the most common weaknesses we see are situations where an inventor is filing their initial patent application too late.
Mm,
So you have a situation where an inventor or a company founder gets really excited about the science. They go out, they present it at a conference, or they publish it. And then they come to me after that initial public disclosure has been done, and that's a problem. So in most of the world outside of the US, a public disclosure before the first filing date prevents you from obtaining a patent. And even in the US, you have a 1-year grace period, but that is not something that you want to rely on. So one of the most important things I think that I would like to get to all inventors and founders out there is if you've got a great idea, make sure you can develop it and get your application filed. That being said, filing too early is also a problem, especially in biotech or life sciences. And I think that's a situation that is often underappreciated by inventors and founders. So if you file an application before you really have sufficient data to support broad claims, you may be able to get a patent to issue eventually, but it may not actually cover your final commercial embodiment. And there's a number of reasons for this. Science inherently evolves as you go through your R&D process. So for example, your particular small molecule might get optimized, your formulation might change, your indication might shift depending on what your preclinical trial work looks like. And the patent that you filed in your first year may no longer map to the product that you actually end up developing or planning to commercialize in year 5 or later. So in this regard, you end up consuming a lot of patent term and you've created a public disclosure that competitors can read, but you don't end up really protecting what matters. So timing the filing to capture the right inventive concept with the right data behind it, it's really one of the most important and consequential strategic decisions that an early stage biotech company could make. And the third one that I see over and over and over again has to do with IP that's not fully owned by the correct entity. So for example, ownership may be spread between a university, a prior employee, or a co-founder who's since left the company, instead of being consolidated with the commercializing company. And it's not an unsolvable problem, but it really is important to get the chain of title on your intellectual property right in the beginning, because this is something that can be very hard or challenging to clean up later or after the fact.
So when looking at these kinds of issues more systematically, can you walk us through what a due diligence process actually look like from an IP perspective?
Yeah, this is great. And this is a really important aspect, I think, of what we do, especially with respect to servicing our venture capital and family office and investor clients. So due diligence, I would say, is really a structured attempt to answer one question. And that question is, does the company's IP position match the story that the company is telling and selling? And you would be surprised how often the answer to that question is either no or not quite. So our IP diligence process usually starts before we ever look at a single patent. So we want to understand the business first. What's the product? What's the target indication? What's the commercial opportunity? And what are the company's claims that make that position defensible? That narrative sets the benchmark against which we evaluate everything else in our diligence process. So for biotech specifically, the business understanding has to be linked to the foundational science. So we're not just reading the deck, we're going into the data room, we're looking at the R&D plan, the preclinical package, the underlying experimental data. We want to understand whether the science actually supports the claims that are being made, whether the developmental pathway is realistic, and whether the next set of milestones is achievable with the resources that the company currently has on hand. So IP doesn't work in a vacuum. A well-constructed patent portfolio that's built around science that has not been validated, or a research plan that's underfunded, is still going to create a serious problem. So the scientific diligence and the IP diligence work hand in hand and have to inform one another. So usually where we head to as the next stage is that we're going to dive into the patent portfolio itself. And when we do this analysis, we're looking at what's issued, what's pending, what the claims actually cover. We're not just skimming through the titles or the abstracts, but we want to actually look at the claim language and the application language underneath it that supports it. So we map the claims against the commercial product to make sure that there's true alignment there. And then I think once we've done that sort of portfolio level analysis, we're looking at freedom to operate. And this is really a separate analysis from the portfolio analysis. You can have a great patent portfolio and still be blocked by someone else's upstream rights. So when we do an FTO, or freedom to operate, we're really searching third-party patents. We're looking for potential blocking positions and assessing whether there are simple design arounds or licensing needs that have not yet been disclosed. And these are important facts for the investor to understand because they're going to dramatically affect the underlying economics of the deal. We then look at chain of title. So as I mentioned before, understanding that the IP has been assigned correctly is very important. So we look at who actually owns the IP. Was it developed at a university? Was it developed as part of a joint venture? Did a founder do a foundational work on the invention before the company was incorporated? Are all of the assignments in order? More importantly, or as importantly, are all the employment agreements structured in such a way that all employees have a clear obligation to assign to the company? These things sound administrative, but it's where some of the most serious problems in IP chain of title hide. And then finally, we're looking at the prosecution history of all the various members of the patent family, the back and forth between the patent applicant and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office or any foreign patent offices. We want to assess what types of arguments have been made to get the patent allowed. Sometimes those arguments can come back to haunt a company in litigation because they have the effect of narrowing how the claims can be interpreted. And these are all subtle but important red flags that can appear that are really potentially quite difficult for someone who doesn't have a background in IP law to catch and flag. So our whole intellectual property diligence due process typically takes several weeks for a serious portfolio. This can vary depending on sort of how crowded the particular scientific field is. But at the end of this process, what we produce is sort of a ranked risk picture or risk assessment picture of the IP landscape. What's strong, what's vulnerable, what's missing, what issues need to be addressed before a particular deal closes. The goal isn't to slow or kill deals, it's really to make sure that our investors know exactly what they're buying. And at the end of the day, everybody's happier for having that knowledge and that sort of assessment of what their actual risk in the investment is.
And so beyond evaluating individual companies, there's also the broader environment that shapes how innovation develops. So how does regulation shape innovation in biotechnology and healthcare?
That's a great question. So I think for us, for my group in particular, we sort of have three areas that we operate at the intersection of. One is the intellectual property itself. The other is all the corporate transactional aspects of putting a deal together. And then the third is just what you've said is the regulatory aspect. And a lot of groups out there do the first two very well, but there are very few groups out there that really bring in the trifecta of having the regulatory group as well. So we have attorneys in our group that focus in particular on FDA regulatory law. And regulation at its foundation is one of the most powerful forces that's currently shaping what gets developed and commercialized and how it does so. So the FDA approval pathway really determines what data you need. It determines how long development takes. And ultimately, it determines what your potential commercial opportunity looks like. So that, in effect, ends up shaping capital allocation. So investors will typically follow the pathways where there is the most regulatory clarity. And in particular, right now, areas like cell and gene therapy are attracting enormous investment opportunities, partly because the FDA has signaled how it will evaluate these technologies. Regulation isn't just a set of rules that you have to comply with after the science is done. It's a strategic input that you need to really be considering from day one.
And looking ahead, as new technologies continue to emerge, now we're in such an AI era. As AI becomes more involved in scientific discovery, what kinds of legal questions start to emerge?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a really foundational one with respect to inventions. So patent law requires a human inventor, someone who's conceived of and claimed a particular invention. And AI creates challenges here. So if an AI system identifies a compound, optimizes a molecule, or generates a novel hypothesis, who is the inventor? In the US, under US law, AI can't be a named inventor. But the practical assessment is actually quite a bit harder. What did the human actually contribute? What questions did it ask to focus the results that are being generated by the AI? And is that contribution really sufficient to establish inventorship for the individual involved? We're also seeing questions around ideas of ownership of AI-generated data sets, trade secret protection for proprietary models, and how to disclose AI contributions in both patents and publications. I think these questions are ultimately going to end up being litigated, and the outcomes of those litigations are going to be what shapes how the entire field documents and manages AI-assisted discovery. But I think a good practice tip for the here and now, while we wait for those black and white lines to be drawn, is I think as inventors are working through the invention and discovery process, I think you really want to make sure that you are documenting what roles the human inventors are playing throughout the process. That's going to be important for any potential downstream ownership or litigation that you might end up in as an emerging company.
And given all of these factors from IP to regulation to emergent technologies, what makes an AI-driven or data-driven claim in biotech feel credible rather than speculative?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think really what the key comes down to is that you want to validate it against an independently derived data set if possible. I think you want to have reproducibility by other groups, and I think you're going to want to have a very clear understanding and transparency about what the specific AI model's limitations are, and what types of failures or hallucinations it might be tempted to make, sort of as an inherent aspect of that particular LLM model. I think ultimately, prospective clinical evidence, an AI generated hypothesis has got to be tested, both in vitro and in vivo, and then ultimately in patients. The technology is undeniably powerful, but the history of biotech is sort of littered with promising platform claims that never actually translated into commercial reality. So I think when it comes to AI generating data that's used in foundational biotech research, the credibility bar really needs to be set very high. And I think companies that really understand that are going to know that, and they're going to welcome investor and regulatory agency scrutiny into what they're doing and how the AI is interfacing with what they're doing.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think this has been a really insightful conversation, especially in highlighting how innovation in biotechnology is shaped not just by science, but also by intellectual property, regulation, and emerging technologies like AI. So thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time to share your perspective with us today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to BERYL Elites.